This is the one about Satan. So the next thing we need to talk about in Girard's language is the Satan, or the adversary. And one of the first questions that will come up when people read Girard is, does he think Satan is an objective being that opposes God, or is Satan a metaphor, a concept that he's using? And that's actually a tough question to answer, because depending on what part of Girard you're reading, that will be a little bit obscure. Girard talks about a triple correspondence between the first murder, the lie that covers it, and Satan. And what he's talking about there is that first spontaneous use of the scapegoat mechanism, where we rose up in violence, we murdered someone. In the biblical story, that's the murder of Abel. But in the human story, that's any time a community rises up, uses violence against a scapegoat, and then lies to cover it up by saying it was a good thing and using that violence to bring social cohesion. So the violence, the lie that covers it, and Satan is a triple correspondence. They're all really the same thing for Girard. And yet at the same time, sometimes he will speak of Girard very much like an objective being. And I think that's actually probably pretty close to how the biblical literature speaks. Sometimes Satan seems to be a concept, all that opposes the divine, and sometimes Satan seems to be a being. I'm not sure that actually clarifying that is helpful. I think some ambiguity there is more faithful to the biblical text. But it is really fascinating to see the ways that Girard uses the concept of Satan. In Mark 3, Jesus' critics, his detractors, come to him and they accuse him of driving out demons by the power of Beelzebub. I'll read you his response here. This is Mark chapter 3, verse is 23. Jesus says, "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house." Now, the very fact that Jesus responds to his critics and shifts from the language of Beelzebub to the language of Satan shows us that these are terms that are largely interchangeable. Jesus switches the language, nobody blinks at that, nobody objects to that, and that shows that sort of in the common parlance they were interchangeable. But what we have here is a really fascinating passage. The normal reading that you will get most often in commentaries is that Jesus is reducing this to the absurdity of the argument against him. His critics say, "You're driving out Satan by the power of Satan." He says, "Oh, that's crazy. That doesn't even make any sense. If I'm working for Satan, why would I be at work driving out Satan?" And on its surface, he's sort of dismissing their argument out of hand. But what Girard recognizes here is a real depth to Jesus' response that belays the sort of surface understanding that we get. And that is sort of very typical of Jesus' parable style of teaching. That there's a surface level that we can kind of get and process and move on, but then there is a deeper meaning that sits with us, it stays with us, it sticks with us, and only when we really have our eyes open to it do we come back and uncover the full meaning of it. I'll read you a quote here from Girard, and this comes from his book, "I See Satan Fall Like Lightning." Jesus does not deny the reality of Satan's self-expulsion, he asserts it. The proof that Satan possesses this power is the affirmation, frequently repeated, that this power is coming to its end. The imminent fall of Satan, prophesied by Christ, is one and the same thing as the end of his power of self-expulsion. The demonic or satanic expulsion of demons has worked previously, at least temporarily, because the violent outcome of scandal, the violent expulsion of scapegoats, always works for a while. What Girard is getting at here is that he recognizes that the way Satan controls us, and again, it doesn't really matter whether you conceptualize Satan as a being who is a malevolent force opposed to God, or whether you conceptualize Satan in a broader sense of all of what is part of the human experience, but pushing back against the divine. He says, the way that Satan takes power or control over us is by continually goading us into violence against a scapegoat. As soon as we create our peace by directing violence against a scapegoat, we are then under the control of the first murder, the lie that covers it up, and the Satan. That's the triple correspondence. And so whenever Satan begins to lose his power over us, what Satan does is raise up a demon, raise up a scapegoat, raise up an appearance of Satan in our midst, so that the community rallies together against that adversary. When the community identifies that adversary, when that community scapegoats that adversary, when the community directs their violence against that adversary is driven out, and in that, the power of Satan is affirmed over the community again. Peace returns, because that's what it looks like when violence is used for social cohesion. But the truth is, we have actually given ourselves over to the violence of the scapegoat mechanism. Ched Myers sees something very similar going on in the final climactic moment of Jesus' response. Having laid his opponents bare, Jesus then drops his semantic jousting and spins a thinly veiled political parable in which he likens his mission to a criminal breaking and entering. No one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless the strong man is first bound. Then indeed his house may be plundered. Now, Ched Myers is reading this much more in the context of the political, social, economic reality of the kingdoms of the world versus this new kingdom of God that undermines the assumptions. And I think he's very right in those specific applications here. What Girard would point us to is the larger cosmic concept that underlies all of this. Satan's power comes by rising up a Satan or an adversary in a midst and baiting us into revolting against that adversary violently to maintain the social status quo. What Myers and Girard both recognize here is that Jesus' real mission is to undermine the whole premise. Jesus is the one not who drives out Satan. Satan does that. Jesus is the one who sneaks in, ties up the systems that we think are powerful, and steals the house out from under them. Jesus does this not by opposing an adversary, not by confronting them directly with violence, but in a subversive act of presenting himself as the criminal who undermines the social peace. This is exactly what Girard is getting at. When we play into the systems of peace by directing our frustration against an adversary and a scapegoat, we simply reinforce Satan's power over us. When we refuse to play the game, when we know that we are actually the criminal, when we know that only when we oppose the status quo can we actually be freed from the predatory peace that surrounds us, will we actually ever be able to not overcome Satan, but be freed from the power of Satan. Now, that's pretty theoretical, but think about how important that is when it comes to our world around us. Constantly, we are rising up, we are spotting, we are naming little adversaries, little Satans that we can direct our violence and our anger against. And this is what happens more and more the less the scapegoat mechanism has its control over us. Remember what we talked about in the last video, the apocalypse. As soon as the scapegoat mechanism begins to break down, what happens is a really unstable period in society where the previous mechanisms are no longer working anymore, and we get desperate and we start lashing out in violence against each other. Well, one of the things you see happening right now is this incredible polarization on the left and the right politically, where everybody sees everyone else as a devil, as an adversary, as a Satan. And I think part of what you're seeing right now is that there are more and more people coming to realize the ways that groups have been marginalized and scapegoated. They recognize this, and they recognize this is wrong. This shouldn't be happening. This is unjust. We have found our social cohesion in the ways that we have villainized, the LGBTQ community. we have found our togetherness in the ways that we have villainized those from other religious backgrounds, and that's wrong. We see it for what it is, but we don't really know how to get along in the world. We don't know how to move throughout the world without an adversary. And so what's happening is this movement away from the scapegoating of the groups that we have traditionally scapegoated, but a sense of we don't know what to do now. And in its place, we have risen up all these new devils and directed our violence against them. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to what we had. The scapegoat, the generative scapegoat mechanism is awful. It is the glorification of sacrifice, and that is fundamentally set against the grace and the peace of the Christ who comes to us to free us from it. But our replacement of traditional scapegoats with violence directed against new scapegoats is actually a way that Satan is reasserting his power over us. Again, this does not mean we can go back to old systems, old mechanisms, old scapegoats again. No one wants to go back to that. But we do have to be careful that in our attempts to move forward, we don't simply trade one Satan for another. Because as soon as we think that we are going to create a more just, a more peaceful, a more Christ-like world through the violence that we direct against an adversary, then we are subsuming ourselves once again to the power of the Satan. And this is what Girard calls us to. The only way that we can free ourselves from the scapegoat mechanism is to thoroughly renounce violence. It's to refuse to violently drive out our Satans, and instead to give ourselves over as martyrs as need be, but still to actively oppose injustice and violence wherever we see it. Jesus is never passive. Jesus is never okay with injustice where he sees it. But Jesus refuses to give in to the temptation to believe that if we are violent, we will create a more just world. No, what that will do is create another world that is still in the grip of Satan. Walter Wink, in his book Engaging the Powers, Discernment and Resistance in a World of Domination, calls this non-violent direct action. To non-violently directly oppose systems of injustice that surround us, even if that calls us to imitate the model of Christ and the martyrship of Christ, that we give ourselves over to the violence of the world in order to show it for what it really is. And in that, it might be unmasked and the world might actually be redeemed.